Hey guys, and welcome back to another episode of the Renaissance Room podcast. And in today's episode, I'm just coming on to share my thoughts as I always do. And I did think about this when I thought about it. I'm like, do I want to talk about this? But I do. And this is for my believers, men and women of God, right? And when I say women of God, I mean people who really are heavily religious and it's something that you practice. And I don't even want to say heavily religious, but your faith is a marker. And it dictates how you conduct yourself, right? And so there was this video going around and they were talking about like Christian dating. And I don't really care to give reference to who the video was and, et cetera, just because I just don't really care to. Y'all know I've always kind of been funny about that. But she was talking about dating. And I think one of the things that as I've gotten older, as I've lived and I've learned, I've had trial and error, I've had consequence, I get so angry when I hear people talk about dating as Christians and the advice that they give these really, really large audiences. I mean, you're talking 100,000 views on these videos, right? Comments flooded, 400, 500 people in these comments. I get so angry about the dating advice, especially today. It's because I just feel like it's coming from a bunch of people who have very limited life experience. And I think in part, I always kind of question this, like, what is this dynamic, that I find to be so prevalent with those who are like heavily religious, right? Maybe some PK kids born and raised in the church or, pretty much, and you meet these people and it's like, sure. You talk about purity and purification and like, it's beautiful, it's beautiful. I'm not knocking it, but it's like, they were so inexperienced. And it's like they get these platforms and they come online and they want to try to give advice and they want to talk. And it's like they just completely ignore, all of the very like hard truths and hard realities, and I think everybody, and you guys know, I've grappled with this for a very long time. We've had these conversations before, right? How do we critique the church while still, preserving Jesus Christ in his name, all right, and all his loving goodness and kindness and his glory, okay? But how do we address the realities that like a lot of these spaces are not, I don't want to say they're not safe spaces, but I'll say that the advice that they give, it's terrible advice. And I think that when you listen to a lot of these Christian influencers, these Christian podcasters, like, and I'm talking about the Black ones, and I'm sure it's probably the same for white influencers and, but that's, hey, wherever you at and how you begin your information is that, it's just so immature to me. And it's like, I listen to their videos. I listen to, their podcasts and the commentary they have around certain conversations. And sometimes it is wisdom, right? You can see that some people are able to apply some biblical wisdom, and it's insightful and it's beautiful, because not too many people who can really decipher and read the Bible and actually apply it and, understand it, in a way that doesn't dilute it or doesn't, like you can feel that it hits different. But I feel like for a lot of people who make this type of content, it is so hard to watch because they are, you can just even tell and just listening to them and hearing them talk, it's like they're so incredibly immature, and when I hear the conversations and they're like, so zealous about dating, now that they've got married and now they have a platform or they're coming on to talk to other women who are single in the church and, because they got their husband, it makes me wonder, like, are these people genuinely satisfied, who in their relationships, or are they just happy that they just get to have sex after several years, And so I don't know, I know that's such a harsh thing. I know it's a little bit uncommon for my platform. Like I said, I don't typically talk about stuff like this, but I think just for the sake of culture, documenting culture and just kind of, I don't know, bringing a little awareness to the conversation. I heard her, I don't know if she was an author, but she was just saying like, finding godly women in your life. And I don't know. I just think that there's really something about faith that becomes real when you actually have to put it into practice. I think there's really something in actually having to live and like really hold on to the promises of God. Like you need that Jeremiah 29:11. Like it needs to come through. It's coming through today. You know what I mean? Like I just think there's really something in when your faith becomes real. And I think when it becomes real, you really do humble yourself, right? And it's very humbling in a lot of different ways, because it's like you realize that so much of where you are is nothing more than God's grace, right? Like you look at the tragedy that you're really shielded from, within your life, right? Your blessings, like, you're not heaping calamity, and it's probably because you are doing the right things and you are, a doer of the word, right? If you're a believer, obviously this podcast is for you. So you're listening, I would hope. That's why you clicked on the video. But it's just one of those things. I think when it's something that you really have to practice, it's humbling. It's almost like it's like it comes to life in your real life. And so you don't do, and I'm saying all that to say, I think when it becomes real and it becomes something that you have to practice and live out on a daily basis, you actually don't really become this doer. Like you don't become this talker. Right. So when it becomes real, when it gets real, when you really got to live that thing out, like, and you're reading things and you're applying it, right? Like when you're, because, we can be in school, we can be reading knowledge, or, what am I saying? We could be reading books, right? And we can have the knowledge, but are you applying it, right? Your life doesn't change until you start putting things into practice. And I think that's one of the things that I kind of noticed with a lot of Christian influencers and a lot of their spaces, right? In terms of their podcasts and things like that. It's like, you just have a bunch of people who never really had to live it out. You know what I mean? When you've never really had to live it out, it's so easy to get online and talk about X, Y, and Z. You know what I mean? And I say this all the time, and I'm not knocking anybody. I think we all have different experiences for a reason. And it's not the Christian thing. It's not, it's just life, But I don't think that people realize how narrow sometimes stability can be. And what I mean by that is like people who met and got married at 15 and they've been married their entire lives. And it's not to say that people can't grow in marriage, but marriage does oftentimes, it could be a building block for stability for some people, and they can go off and self-actualize and build on that. And then for some people, you really do kind of get comfortable and you kind of stay in this very narrow lane. And it's not just about dating. It's just life in general, and it's not a bad thing, right? Stability is a good thing. We should strive to have stability, but certain experiences that we have in our lives can shape our perspectives. And I understand, right? You may say, well, isn't this what the narrow road is? Not necessarily. Not necessarily. I don't actually think that that's where that scripture applies, right? Like, I don't think it's that, although it's not a bad thing, right? But I just think that, if you're trying to reach people, because obviously you're not talking, we come on these platforms, or for example, they come on these platforms, they're not trying to reach people that are also living that same life, right? They're trying to the whole goal of discipleship is to reach the one, right, outside of the 99. And so it's like you have these platforms and I don't think they can really reach anybody. I'm just going to be honest. I think that I don't think they reach anybody because it's just very exclusionary. I think Christian communities in today, just in general, really can be very exclusive. Can be very exclusive. And I don't know. It's a sad thing, but I think it makes you question, who is it marketed to? And I'm trying not to say this so matter of factly, right? And again, I always tell you guys that, trying to look at some of the flaws within Christian culture and within this space, right, of Christianity and believers, and the messages that, people receive about how to conduct themselves in dating and relationships. I don't want to do it in a way that's harsh, right? And I don't want to do it in a way that, takes away from, the truth and reality of God. Like, I do believe in God. I think God is, I don't want to say, I think I know God is real, right? But it is one of those things to where, if I'm just being honest, like, there's a lot of immaturity within that. I don't typically meet a lot of people who may be born and raised in religion who are really equipped to do life, right? Like, something about religion in itself is fundamentally or inherently immature. And I don't know, I don't know if it's a bad thing. Right. And when I say immature, I'm talking about there's something in it that lacks real and needed self-sufficiency, right? Like, what is needed to live a good and purposeful life, it's something that it robs people of, right? Like I meet people and they just don't really know how to show up in the world. Right. And obviously, we know that, people who are typically really, born and raised in these communities, they are against secularism. So they're, sometimes against college, or they, reject quote unquote worldly wisdom. Again, I think that might be something that could be out of context. But either way, they really lack duality. And I don't know if that, this thing of like being on the straight and narrow, I don't know if that's what Jesus meant. I don't know. So I'm not here to really get into, what people should do with their lives, their bodies, their values. I'm not here to get into that. But what I am saying is that something that I really find to be very prevalent, even in the minds of people who are 34, 44, whatever, and people who grow up, born and raised in the church, what you typically find is this deep, deep repression. And alongside of that, there seems to be this prerequisite of arrested development, right? There's really no opportunity for these people to explore their individuality. And so to me, when you think about the harm, I mean, it's not necessarily I wouldn't say it's necessarily harmful per se, but I mean, I do think that, maybe it is harmful actually. And I don't think the intention is to be harmful. But sometimes intentions aren't enough. Right. And so, when I'm listening to this lady, and, I think she's older than me, so I'm going to refer to her, as a lady, not a young woman. She's talking about, dating, and she's talking about how, you need to find someone who can, guide you as a woman. And it's like, I just don't think we take into consideration how so many people, right, come into religious spaces. They don't have that level, they don't have this sense of self-sufficiency. So they oftentimes are struggling with low self-esteem, right? We know the church is the place for the sick, right? And so really what I'm saying is that there's really something dangerous in, seeking out leadership from other people. Like, I'm not here to say, you shouldn't have mentors, and you should, but oftentimes when we talk about mentors, we are typically talking about people who can kind of guide us in one area of our lives, but, God kind of does the rest, right? But I just think there's really something that people surrender whenever someone comes to them in the name of God, right? Whenever someone says, oh, I'm a woman who prays, or, they have Jesus in their bio, something drops in you, right? Like the guards go down and you are just so wide open, and you don't really know what you're getting into. You fail to kind of see this person as a person. And I think for people who have never had the experience of like the betrayals, or who have never experienced real harm, under these type of ideologies, push these messages in blindness, and it sounds good. And it seems like, okay, they're just wise and it works out. But it's like, there's so many factors that kind of go into, actually having good fellowship and actually meeting people who are genuine, but I'm going to be honest, I don't think that's the reality for most people. And I think something that's really saddening, or at least, deafening, the church just doesn't seem to get this. They refuse to kind of turn a blind eye to the people. They refuse to hear the cries of the people who have been burned, who have been betrayed, and who have been harmed, right? And who have been disappointed. And they refuse to kind of look and be like, okay, what's going on here, right? And not just the people that have, unfortunately failed to guard their hearts, right? And who have been deceived under the guise of, people who kind of preach one thing, but live their lives in a completely different way, right? People who have essentially dropped their guards, right? But they also turn a blind eye to the people who are stuck, right? The people who are not growing. And the thing about religion, and you talk about all this content, and it's like, we can come online and we can have zeal and we can have passion for Christ and we can be teachers, right? But at the end of the day, you get off of the camera and you go on and you live your life. And it's not to say that people are deceptive or people are dishonest. No, that's just to say that you're still a human at the end of the day. So it's really interesting, I think, when you think about the level of influence and this, like, I don't know, what do you want to call it? Maybe it's a spiritual veil. I have no idea, right? But people almost are like on podcasts and in these platforms, and they have like this halo, and they like preach and they talk all these different things and they kind of share all this stuff. But it's like, they can't meet you in real life because they don't know how to do real life, right? Like, so it's like, it's almost like disillusion, because it's like, you have people who on one end, they can come online, they can have all these platforms, and they can, be so zealous for Christ, and they can talk so much, and they can, about the Bible, and they can quote scripture, and they can talk about what worked for them, and da 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 da. But then it's like, when you meet these people in real life, when you're just meeting the person without all the spiritual language, it's like they can't do life with you. And so it's interesting how Christianity can become a bit isolating. And I don't know if it's because of all that teaching, people start to feel a little bit more self-conscious about their behaviors, or because it just creates this expectation of perfection that people can't live up to. Or, it kind of creates this thing where you look at these people and you're like, okay, they're talking their stuff, and, maybe you think they have it all figured out or whatever, but I don't know what it is, y'all. I guess I'm just saying that it's very interesting to me how within Christian communities, sometimes it's not about fellowship, but people are, sticking with each other, not necessarily for like-mindedness, but because they share the same dysfunction, right? And they don't know how to interact with people in the real world, right? Perhaps they believe that, fundamentally people are this or people are that or whatever. But it's like, it isn't until you profess Jesus to these people that they start to trust you. And obviously this is incredibly dangerous. And that's my entire premise for this podcast, is because people are deceptive, right? And people can use you and people can harm you, right? But it's like, if you just believe, then whatever. And so when I listen to the podcast about Christian dating, and I see the clips on my YouTube shorts, and I see all the views, and I see all the commentators, my concern for these people, my concern for this is like, okay, we know within religious communities, right, you get married pretty quickly. Some of that is, because you want a bone. And then some of it, just might be because what is, required, or, whatever. I don't know, what is expected. But how much of it is genuine, though? And like I said, when you have people who have been waiting their entire lives, or maybe waiting for years to be intimate with someone, right? How many of these marriages and this dating advice, rather, that they're giving, how much of that is really successful, and how much of that is really just, them being maybe prideful, or, simply happy because they're finally getting laid, and I know that's like, Jalen, now, how dare you get up on here and say that, and I'm not like, don't take away from this. I'm saying God's not good. I'm not saying any of that. I'm just saying, hey, listen. There seems to be a disconnect with a lot of these so-called believers, right? And I think the biggest disconnect is that you meet these people in real life. They don't know how to hold a conversation. They don't know how to simply live. And oftentimes they can quote scripture, but they don't know how to apply it. There's no real application. And the reason being is because they may not have had experiences in their lives where they actually, like, have you ever really had to like call on Jesus? I mean, like listen, it ain't looking too good. You know what I mean? And it's not to say that, those who grow up in the church and maybe PK kids don't have they don't have trials. Everybody has trials. If you're alive, you're going to have a trial. Okay. And I'm not here to take that from anybody, but I don't know, you guys. I think, you have this message, and it's like, we wouldn't go through certain things in life, right? If it wasn't for our own lusts and our own desires and our own, temptations, which is true, right? I can attest to that. Sometimes we make choices based on based on where we are. And, unfortunately, there's consequences to some of those choices. But if God be for us, right, I said this earlier, but seriously, and if everything is going to work for my good, and if God has a plan for me, why am I so afraid to live, right? Why am I living in a little bubble? You know what I mean? Why am I afraid to follow the usherings of the Holy Spirit? And what is the ushering? What is God telling you to do? What do you feel on the inside of you? And I think so many believers, unfortunately, you talk about dating, and that's such a serious thing. Because like I said, you have a lot of people who profess Jesus, and they stab you in the back, quite literally, sometimes spiritually, sometimes literally. You know what I mean? So it's like, I think that it's just to the point where these messages are dangerous. All right. And that's honestly what I'm just saying, right? Like these conversations around dating, marriage, all of that is very dangerous. Like, and I don't think that they are talking about it enough, and they probably not talking about it enough because they don't have that experience. But obviously that is incredibly harmful, and it's misleading when people have millions of followers and they have these very big platforms and they have no wisdom, right? Like, it's not enough to hey, let me patch you up. Let me give you all the preventatives, right? That's not enough when you're already out here on the road. You know what I mean? You can't put the donut in the tire. You can't put the donut of the tire in the, you can't put the donut in the trunk of the car, and the car is already on the road. All right. Like if you didn't put the donut, it's on the road. All right. And I don't know if that's a good enough analogy, but I think I'm making myself clear. I don't want to be redundant here, but I think I'm being clear. Okay. And that's all I'm saying. I just think that this stuff can be incredibly harmful. And I think that it does absolutely result in arrested development, because instead of you living your own life and you developing your own relationship and you allowing God to guide you, right? If God is a spirit and if God is within you, then that I think that means you can trust yourself. You can trust yourself in the sense that, hey, something doesn't feel right. Okay, this ain't it. You know what I mean? If so, and I can't really describe that, because I think that it's such an individual case by case basis, right? Me personally, I'm not a theologian. I'm not here to be that, and I don't think that, when it comes to God, I've always said that I think God is an experience. And I think I've said that throughout all of my works, like even when I was writing on my blog, and I'm gonna wrap up here, y'all. I'm going too long, but I've always said that God is an experience. And the reason why I said that is because the way God and how we rolling may not be how you rolling. You know what I mean? And what you do may not be what I do. You know what I mean? And vice versa. But who am I to tell you what God, the all-knowing, the almighty, the omnipresent, who am I to tell you what that should look like? Or what that, I don't have that. That's not my place. You know what I mean? My only place is to be loving. That's it. I'm only here to be loving. I'm only here to be I'm only here to be that. That's it. You know what I mean? I'm only here to be the best person I can be. All right. I want to say a good person, but hey, we fall short of the glory. Okay. So that's always kind of been that. And that's kind of where I stop in regards to that, just because I feel like my faith is so deeply personal to me. And it's just not something I care to market. I genuinely feel like it's a very intimate thing. Like I said, for me, it's real, it's sacred. And hey, how I commune is not how you're going to commune. And I'm completely fine with that. I have no desire to tell you how to do all I can tell you. You ask me, how do I, I'm going to tell you straight up. Like I tell everybody else, honey, prayer. Just pray for 30 days and all right, go ahead on about your business. All right. That's all I got for you. You know what I mean? I'm not here to, because that's just not my thing. Even when I try, I just feel like, to say I'm a representative of something so sacred, something so powerful, but something that also has so much historical context that has been misused, that has been, I don't know if that's a heavy weight, yo. That's a heavy cross to carry. That's a big deal. You know what I mean? And so that's what makes me question too, when you have so many of these Christian influencers, can they even fathom the magnitude of that? Like if you're saying this is can you fathom that? I don't think people can. I think people do what they do. And unfortunately, if you've done it so long, now you have a platform, now you have success, you're going to keep doing it, period. So anyway, let me know what you guys think in the comments. Does religion, i.e. Christianity, sometimes result in arrested development for some people? Is it a blessing to be able to meet Christ later in your life? Is it a blessing to be able to have a faith that is active and real in practice versus a very picture perfect story of how you did everything by the book or by, religious standard or expectation, and your life has now resulted in this whatever quote unquote desirable outcome. Right? Is it better to be a person who, hey, it's kind of on the other side and, it's like, hey, this is, you guys let me know what you think in the comments. Does Christianity oftentimes, depending on how, like I said, we're talking about PK kids, we're talking about people who born and raised in religion, and maybe people who've even been in religion in circles for a long time. Does it lead to arrested development? I would actually argue that it does. Being able to conduct yourself at a business meeting, being able to, develop your career, a means to provide for your family, right? Being able to date, and go out and have a nice time and enjoy a glass of wine or whatever your drink of choice, and enjoy adult conversation and adult company and adult things, right? Like, is that bad? right? And you talk about the beliefs within Christianity, the expectation, right? Is it such a bad thing to go out and enjoy yourself and have an adult time? You know what I mean? Like an adult, you know what I mean? To conduct yourself like an adult. Is that such a bad thing? Right. So it's not a matter of, giving way to sin, but I just think for some of the conversations, and I think for far too long, it's all these really petty things. Right. And we don't take into consideration, well, hey, there are pedophiles out there. There are, people who have deceived people out of, 401ks, you know what I mean? People have been murdered. Like, bro, there's so many horrible things going on in the world. I don't think that Jesus is going to be tripping if I'm having a glass of wine. I just got off of work. All right. It's been a long day. It's been a long day, long shift. Right. And I don't want to get too specific because, again, I think that even loses its plot. Right. I think sometimes when we start to get so specific, this gives way to argument. Right. Especially when you start talking about Christians. All right. And sometimes, you got to keep it in a parable. Say little. Right. And honestly, I've said too much. So I'm going to go. I wanted to come on and share that because, like I said, I just think it just gets to a point where, it's just getting too harmful. It's too harmful. I think that we can be wise, and I think we should be wise. Peace.